Welcome to Time to Teach with Tammy, the podcast that gives tips, advice, and suggestions to teachers by a real teacher. So sit back and enjoy. And oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe. And we're back. Welcome to episode 90 of Time to Teach. I'm very excited for today's episode for a couple of reasons. Number one, episode 90, that kind of feels like a milestone, although I get that episode 100 really will be the milestone. But I don't know, every time we get into another bracket there, I just feel like, okay, we are making progress here. And of course, it just reminds me how much this show has grown since the beginning. I mean, I guess it hasn't really grown that much. When I say grow, I just mean kind of in its development, my comfort level with podcasting, the different topics that have been discussed here. So it's kind of exciting. The other reason why I'm excited about today's episode is because episode 90, today's episode is entitled Tracking Student Data So You Don't Get Behind. I guess that sounds like a very boring topic now that I say it out loud, but I'm actually very passionate about this. Trying to stay on top of student data. Yes, I know just the term itself can probably get a lot of eye rolling and sighs. It's what I would say is one of those necessary evils, if we must define it as such. We have to know where our students are at. I mean, just bottom line. And I know that that's kind of a buzzword in education, student data and analyzing data. But yeah, it's something that we have to be doing. So I really do make a conscious effort at doing this, which is why I really wanted to discuss it. The last several episodes, and I would say probably all of the episodes for this new school year so far have been really focusing on efficiency and getting things done the best we can in the most efficient way so that we can be productive. And I thought that was very, very appropriate for the beginning of the school year as we're all kind of settling in. And that's great for new teachers and veteran teachers alike, where, I'm always looking for better ways to do things. I just always want to grow in my productivity and my efficiency. So now I feel like now that we are all into our school year, we have established routines, habits, we've built community. By the way, building community is never a one and done. We are always continuing that. So I'm not suggesting that that's finished. I just mean, I know we had great emphasis on that, and now maybe we are a little more able to dive into some of the other things. So I feel like it's a really good time in the school year to be starting to look at other things such as staying on top of data and student progress and what we do with that. So that is exactly what today's episode is going to be about. If that is something that interests you, be sure to continue to tune in. Okay, so I am just going to go ahead and get started with today's topic now. I know when we say student data, it sounds very cold and concrete and formal and official, and it can be all of those things. But I am here to say that student data also includes other things that might be more observational, that might be perhaps less cold, less formal, less official. It includes everything. And I think that would be one of the things that I really want to emphasize on today's episode, is that there's more than just the summative. And I think we're at a place in education where we know that, but I want to make it clear, and I want to share ways that we can include student data So what does that include? When I'm looking at student data, so I am primarily drawing upon my own experience in the classroom and what I do on a daily basis. You have to be very, very observant as a teacher. You have to know what you're looking for. I think it really helps when you know that age group, you know the subject, you are very comfortable. So you're kind of familiar. I think maybe familiar is maybe a better word than comfortable, although the more familiar you are, the more comfortable you are. So I guess it goes hand in hand. But for example, I've been working in my grade level now. I'm a pre-first teacher. I teach down in Mexico. If you haven't heard, now you know. I teach at an international school. So, yeah, I've been working at this grade level for 8 years. Love love it so much. My kids are ages 5 and 6. They're young learners, but just being that I've been in this age group for so many years, there are things that you become familiar with, or trends that you see. You can kind of preconceive misunderstandings and confusions before they happen because you've noticed it so frequently. I know in the States, and especially in public schools, you might not have the luxury to have been in an age group and a grade level for years and years. Oftentimes teachers are being asked to move and change grades, which I think also could be a good thing, but it could be a frustrating thing because every time you're starting with a new grade level, it's probably you're starting all over again. So that I also get that can be frustrating. But I say it can also be beneficial because you get someone like me who's like, yeah, I've been teaching pre-first for 8 years, but that also means that then I have less knowledge of other grades. I have less experience in other, age groups, content, strategies that might work in those things. And sometimes I feel like that could be at my disadvantage. And especially being someone who's super interested in always growing and being better than even the day before. Those are things that I wouldn't say worry me, but definitely make me question. I always want to challenge myself, but anyway, so I think there are pros and cons to both. So in any case, one of the advantages of really knowing your age group is you can preconceive misunderstandings and extra support that are going to be needed. Let me throw out an example. We have been working in math workshop on kind of comparing quantities to be able to determine how many more there are and how many fewer there are. And I know every year that this is a concept that my kids need multiple exposure, multiple experiences, different ways to work with this concept. So whether it's through building cube towers, comparing dots, like dot cards, and creating it visually and strategically finding, comparing what's the same, what's different. I even have my kids, if they're doing a drawing or they're working with dot cards, then circle the extra ones in the larger quantity and the quantity that has more. So I because I know that every year this is a concept that my kids struggle with, I'm totally ready for that, and I don't necessarily feel like a failure as a teacher. I am actually always still looking on how can I better do this so that maybe my students can understand this concept more quickly. But I just know they need multiple exposure, and I know what to look for, and I know that this is something that we need to be spiraling through, and I keep spiraling through it because of that. So that's an advantage for me, just kind of knowing that. So anyway, I feel like I kind of just went off on a tangent. All of that was basically to say it is really important to be aware of what's happening with your students. Just paying attention to misunderstandings, confusions, understandings, being aware and knowledgeable of what's happening on a daily basis in your classroom. So how do we do this? So some of the ways that I am keeping myself aware of what's happening. So I'm including this when I say data. It could be as simple as awareness, consciousness, but there's a little bit more to it. So some things that I do is I will say this. Anecdotal evidence is going to be one of your very best friends. Observations, things that you're seeing. If when you're working with a student in a small group, one-on-one, or even whole group. So to help keep track of this, because yes, you can't just absorb all of it and then imagine you're going to remember all of it, because certainly there's so much that's happening in a school day, in a school week, in a school month. We can't. Your clipboard is going to literally be your best friend. I keep a clipboard with me, and this is where I can jot down things that I need to jot down. So as I'm noticing students and they're working, and I'm like, oh, I noticed that so and so is kind of having difficulty with this concept, I can quickly write down on my clipboard, and I have on the top of my clipboard is my plans for the week, and then below it is where I usually will keep a sheet of paper for observations. And you might have something fancy to write your notes on. It might be, divided by subject matter. It might be divided by kids, or you might be like me and I just grab a white sheet of paper. Like literally anything will work. Sometimes I feel like we get really caught up in needing to have the most high-tech ways of doing things, and I don't think that that we need all that. I mean, yes, it can be helpful, and yes, I'm also not saying that we don't need it. I'm just saying we should never feel like we cannot do something because we don't have the most high-tech way of doing it. Really, for me, my clipboard, sticky notes, a sheet of paper, and my pen are my go-tos. Those are the quickest and easiest and most effective way for me to log things that I'm seeing. I do also have a binder for each student, so I don't know, I wouldn't call it a student like tracking binder or data binder, although it kind of is. This is where I will really just write down things that I'm seeing in the classroom. Maybe if I had a conference with a kid, what happened in that conference, or I will even just write down the observations, so-and-so is struggling with this concept. This is what I saw. I want to be able to remember what exactly were the behaviors that I saw, or what was the struggle, because I know later I'm not going to remember the specifics, but I want to be able to see what I am seeing and what I'm observing and noticing, and just having a place to track that. So like I said, the clipboard, and then what I've been trying to do is take those notes and then later write it in my binder. And you may think, that's a lot of extra work. Why don't you just go straight into your binder? Sometimes I do, but I use the clipboard as a secondary measure to make sure it gets into my binder. What I find that happens is my binder is just sometimes difficult to lug around me, and I used to really try to do that all the time, but just like opening it to the student page, getting it down, it takes up my whole lap. I've just found that sometimes it impedes me getting down the notes that I want. That this year I have found myself more reverting to the clipboard and sticky notes, and then going into the binder. But hey, if it works for you to track it immediately in the binder, do it. I think the main idea is have a system that works for you, that you can be noting what you're seeing in your class. Now, just like I'm going to take notes of what I'm seeing students have difficulty with, have confusion, I'm also noting when I'm seeing that students are understanding a concept. So yeah, they're like totally getting this concept and it's automatic. So for example, when we first started working with the number 10, so we really look at making numbers in our grade level, just for a more solid and in-depth understanding and developing number sense. So making numbers is something we really focus on at our grade level. When I see that that concept becomes pretty automatic for a student, and granted, I don't think that speed and time necessarily tells me the whole picture, but I do know that once a student becomes very automatic with a concept, they do tend to be faster at it. It gives me insight into the depth of their understanding or the depth of their ability to fluidly work with a number. So I will note that too. Like, oh, the student is like, can automatically tell me, if you have 8, how many more do you need to make 10? Or if you have 4, how many more do you need to make 10? If they can say 6 like that, then I know that this is a concept now that they're really becoming more kind of fluid with, right? Because they can kind of quickly, and I don't mean just like because they have their tens facts memorized, but because I'm seeing how fluidly they're working with a concept. If that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm saying expressing what I want to say, but basically you want to note the difficulties and when there's depth of understanding, and how do you know that it's a deep understanding? What are you seeing them do, and making note of that. I used to work heavily with kind of graph paper, and you probably have heard me speak about this many times on the podcast, because I have until recently really been using that as a way to kind of check off concepts as I see students mastering them. Or so basically it would look like graph paper with student names on the left hand side, and at the top would be more like the math concepts, the reading concepts, whatever concepts we're looking at, and I would kind of track it that way. Like, oh yeah, I saw my student perform well this time, and then another time, and then I can kind of see, like, I can see the frequency of how often my student is getting that concept, or how infrequently, and it helps me to focus in on who are those kids who are struggling and just give me more insight. This year though, I kind of been dabbling in using Google Sites as a way of, when I'm working on a concept, I create a Google Sites page I have a whole Google Sites for all the concepts we're working on this year, and I have a page for each concept, and then every day I'm kind of like logging in who's struggling, who's getting it, what I'm seeing, any assessments that we're doing on that, and I'm kind of tracking it that way, because I'm just kind of finding, for me, it's a nice at a glance. So I'm kind of right now using it in lieu of the other sheets, but then that means I'm still having to use the paper to track. So regular, just white sheet of paper, and taking notes, and then going in and reporting it in my Google Sites. So I'm kind of really liking that a lot. And then also it's nice because, if you have someone else, another teacher who you work with, and you need to kind of share evidence, you can kind of refer that to them. I think what got me started on that was last year I did a coaching cycle with our literacy coach. So shout out to our literacy coach, Becky Strong, if you're listening, or if you're a listener who knows her. Woohoo. Thank you, Becky Strong. We were doing a coaching cycle, and so she created a Google Site page for us to kind of track student progress and to collaborate. That also was kind of sparked because I was like, hey, I just don't want to spend a whole lot of time having to collaborate every week. Like, I want to collaborate, but I want to do it virtually. I just know from past experience that that whole collaboration process can be, can take my whole prep period. And when you're a teacher, you really need that time. So we were kind of brainstorming, how can we streamline the collaboration so that it really works and honors and respects our time. And that's what she came up with, and I thought it worked brilliantly. But one thing that we ended up doing was kind of tracking assessments that we were doing, and talking about students, and keep grouping them on this Google site of like kids who were struggling, kids who were getting it. And I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna do that for my own self, and use it as another resource in addition to the graph paper that I use, but it's almost kind of has taken its place. But so this would really all just kind of be example of anecdotal notes, and just really being conscious. So really knowing what you're looking for and keeping track of it, and making sure that you do have a place that's organized that you can refer back to. This is going to be your best friend, because it's going to help you keep on top of what students are doing, and knowing where they are. Some other ideas that I think, so all of this is kind of anecdotal as you're observing. I don't think we should leave out the formative assessment, you guys, is so critical. And again, it doesn't have to be, sometimes I find with my formative assessments, it's can be as simple as having kids check in and like give me a thumbs up. How well do you know understand this concept? And you have to do this frequently. And it's not a perfect system because you're always going to have a few kids who are like, yeah, I understand everything, and they're really struggling. But you'll hopefully, if you're really being conscious and paying attention, you already know that those kids are struggling. But I still find it really helpful because I've noticed when I have the kids kind of do self-reporting, and so what I do is like, a thumb up, close to your heart if you're like, oh, I really understand this, really understand it, I can even teach it to someone else, or a thumb, a sideways thumb if like, well, yeah, I'm getting some of it, but I still have some questions, or, and then what I do instead of, a thumb down, because I know sometimes there's a stigma around that and kids don't want to put their thumb down, I just have them, okay, the thumb in the middle and move it down to your stomach area. If you're like, well, I'm still feel like I have quite a few questions, or don't think I'm quite there yet. And it's, some of the kids who I think seem to have a good handle will even kind of report out that they are not understanding. Again, it's still something you have to kind of dive into, like, why is it? Is it just that maybe I don't know where that feeling is stemming from. If I've seen them performing well, then maybe I need to get to the bottom of it. So it's still, you still need to kind of work that out. But I do find that this is also a great insight into what's going on and can give you some good feedback. Sticky notes is one of my favorite ways, I have done this especially in like small math groups as we're tying up our session, giving them a problem or two, and they just respond to it on the sticky note. They give me the sticky note, I collect the sticky notes, and then I can see like, oh yeah, they like they got this or they didn't get it. But it doesn't have to be. It could be, could be something that you really put together in a couple of questions, you printed it out and you're collecting it. It can be any and all of those things, like the exit slips. But like I said, I really kind of find that for me, I really have been enjoying the self-reflecting for the students, the sticky notes when they do that. Sometimes I'll pull like just a couple of problems from the math book or something like that and have them respond in that and use that as formative assessment. I guess my main point is almost anything can be used as formative assessment. I think it's a matter of us just getting really good at using those things, and really knowing the kind of information it's giving to us and using it to plan those next steps, which is, I think, the most critical part of staying on top of student data is using it for next steps, which is something I'm going to get into in this episode. And then, okay, so we said anecdotal evidence, which would be kind of more observational, making sure you have a place to kind of track it, write it down, and refer back to. Okay, so that's part of staying on top of student data. Formative assessments, which is what I just mentioned, and you could literally use anything, exit slips, pre-created or on the spot with sticky notes on a whiteboard. I didn't even mention that, but that's a great one. And another, like a good way to, if you want to capture because sometimes it's hard with whiteboard. You're like, did I see everyone? You can even take a picture of their responses. There's so many ways to do it. There's so many great things out there. And then the self-reflection piece. Oh, something that I didn't mention that I do with the kind of formative assessments is really pay attention to students' faces, facial expressions, body language. A lot of times, and especially at the lower grades, kids are super expressive. So I really try to pay attention kind of when you see a student melting, aside from it could just mean that they're tired, but you could just kind of see in their faces when there's a struggle. So it's really important to pay attention to that. That's giving you feedback as well. That's a formative assessment. And then it's kind of like, okay, then why? Why are we struggling, or why are you finding this difficult? So seeing it first in their body language and then facial expressions and paying attention to that, and then digging deeper into, okay, what is it that's going on? That I think is important too. That can be a formative assessment. Okay, next little tidbit that I will say, something that I do and have been doing now for the last couple of years, is planning a day in my week for more formal assessing and observations. This is tricky, you guys, because I will say, even though I love that it keeps me on top of things, you also have to know that anytime you're doing a formal, when you're setting aside time to do formal observations, it might be taking away from instructional time, or it might be taking away time that you would have been working in small groups, which is instructional time. So it's a fine balance. You have to see what works for you. I use every Friday as a day to do more like formal observations and, well, not observations, but assessments. You could also do every 2 weeks if every week just seems like a heavy load. But I just find that because students can progress so rapidly, especially at my age group, they're kind of non-readers for most of them. Some of them come in reading, but since they're primarily non-readers, non-writers, at the beginning of the year, they can progress rather quickly, and I really want to stay on top of their progression. I don't want to miss it. And even by staying on top of it, I end up having kiddos who are moving rapidly, and I'm like, oh, I missed something there, because I'm trying to work with everyone. I mean, it's so hard being a teacher. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it is so hard. So hard to keep on top of all of that. Even in your greatest attempts at it, you see that you missed something. So I think lesson to me is there's always going to be something that I miss, so I really have to be very conscious of how I do this. But anyway, for me, my day of assessment are Fridays. I'm assessing. So let me tell you a little bit about how I do that. So instead of working with small groups, I work with individual students. I pull them to the back table. So I'm still actually having whole group mini lessons and teaching on that day, but the difference is, instead of pulling a small group, which is still losing instructional time, because in a small group I would be teaching more in depth at their level and to their needs. So I don't get to do that on Friday because I'm trying to check in and see where students are. So I will pull students. I'm pulling and checking right now letter names, letter sounds, because I did a day of that in August, probably more like September. But I'm trying to assess that and then see where they are in their sight word knowledge. So I do that. I check their reading of CBC words, and I will specifically check in on, say, the whatever we were working on that week. So this past week was short E words. So check in to see how they're reading and even spelling short E words. And then I try to do, like for math workshop, our math quote unquote warm up is a check-in. Check-in is kind of code for like a formative assessment. And then I'll kind of check in on whatever concept in math we've been working on, and I use that. So Friday is kind of my day for that. Again, I don't know that I feel like it's perfect. I don't know. I feel like it's been very helpful for me to make sure that I'm keeping track of student progress. But again, like I said, there's always that fine line of, if I'm doing a check-in, then I'm also not doing an in-depth instructional day. I don't know, you guys. It's, give and take. Something has to give. It's part of what we do. Luckily, my TA can still run groups, so there's still, students who are being catered to. But I wish there was a way. I wish there was more time. That's what I wish. But there's not, so I'm working with what I have. And then it at least allows for those days that I can do more in-depth teaching to really be a little more accurate in the needs of my groups instead of just kind of guessing. Um, so I guess that would be an advantage of that. And then, so anyway, then what I do, and this was one of the main things that I really wanted to say, I think there are some really important points that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at student data, um, is that we're not just observing, noting, recording, giving formative assessments, having days where we have more formal check-ins or at least a designated day. We're not just doing that and then, okay, yeah, I did that. The important thing is then you're actually taking time to be reflective of the data. If you're collecting all of this data but then doing nothing, you might as well not even do it. There's no point. The point is that you're reflective of the data, kind of looking at making sure as you're looking over your notes for the day, notes for the week, all of this. Okay, what information is it telling me? What is it telling me that my students are struggling with? What does that mean in terms of my instruction? What do I need to change? Because it might not always be what is it that my students need. What is it that I need to do differently? That's part of it, but we also have to remember, what does it mean for me instructionally? Are there other strategies I could be trying? Is there something that I'm maybe not being clear with? Because I definitely think sometimes I look at that and I'm like, I have had times where I'm like, oh, most of my kids struggled with this. That's a me thing. Maybe I thought I taught it really well, but clearly I need to continue with this concept. I need to teach it in a different way, or I need to sometimes it's just that it's multiple exposure. I know that is true when it comes to using checklists and rubrics with my students. My goodness, my students are so young. I'm not sure that in their prior schooling that they've really done self-evaluations before. Maybe because that's kind of a heavy topic that we're really focused on, maybe now my students will have had more exposure, but typically in the past at age 5 and 6 they really have not had much exposure with that. Like I was saying at the beginning of the episode, I know my kids struggle with comparing numbers and determining how many more, how many fewer. They're usually very good at how many more. How many fewer is a little bit difficult, and it's just that vocabulary word, getting them to understand that it's really the same. If I'm comparing if I'm comparing 4 and 6, I know that 6 is 2 more than 4. I just really need to understand that the answer is the same with the number 4. It's 2 fewer. 4 is 2 fewer than 6. So getting that across, I know my kids always struggle with. So how do we, how can I make that apparent, maybe more quickly? And I am actually trying some different things this year with that. So I'm checking to see if maybe I can get them to that concept even earlier. That will help me in the future when I teach that concept. So, so that's the big thing, is that, we're not just collecting all this data and then it sits on our shelf, or it sits in a Google site, or it sits in a binder or on my clipboard, but I'm looking at it and really thinking, what is it telling me? And what isn't it telling me? What is it not telling me? I think those questions are important to have, because they're not so obvious. I always kind of go back to, and I do this with everything, what do I not know about this? What is it that this is not telling me, or what are the questions that are not being answered with this? And that can lead back to answers or insights about my instruction, about the students, about prior knowledge, about the way things were set up in a lesson. So we have to be looking at all of those things. But that is the most critical piece, is that we're reflecting on it and then we're planning next steps in instruction and small groups for students, giving them more time, honoring if they need more time, not just being like, oh, so-and-so didn't get it, too bad for so-and-so. they're going to really have a hard time now moving forward. No, we as educators, it's our job to get them there. So if that means more time, then we give them more time. Usually it's going to be more time, and it might be more time, but also in another way. Be teaching them in another way, giving them another outlet to try something. Maybe it was that we didn't give them the most effective way for them to express their knowledge. So we really have to look at all of those things. It's hugely important. Another important thing as we're looking over data and what does it mean, where are we going, is you really want to be looking at evidence over a time period. So, we never want to hold it against the student if they didn't get a concept initially. Again, this is about giving them more time. So, for example, when it comes to grading, and I've got some strong thoughts on that, I am so thankful to my school and my section. We are standard based. We don't give out grades, we report on standards, and I so appreciate that. And it really allows us to give students time. It's just so hugely important. We never want to say, oh, I just don't agree with averaging a student's performance throughout a grading period or a reporting period. Like, well, they really struggled those first 4 times we did it. Yeah, the last 5 times they did great. They showed that they had mastery, but because they struggled those first 4 times when we first began learning the concept, I can only give them a C. That's really at a disadvantage to the students, not honoring the process and the development. And what I think we should be doing as educators, of course, when we're first learning concept, of course they're grappling with it and they're struggling. We need to, I keep saying this in Twitter chats, but we really need to normalize failure as part of the process of learning. You're going to fail a few times. Gee, if I were fired as a teacher because of my first few years of teaching, I would never have had the opportunity to improve myself as a teacher. And this is true for every new thing I do as a teacher. I am constantly struggling and constantly failing, but thank goodness I have colleagues who forgive me. I have a school that really embraces growth mindset and who are patient with me, so that as I'm learning new things and I'm struggling and I'm failing, they don't just throw me away. They don't just get rid of me. They don't call me ineffective. They honor the time that I need. And I think we need to do the same for our students. We're looking to get them to mastery. What that takes for each student can look different. The time involved can look different. So when we're keeping on top of student data, we really want to make sure that we're looking at evidence over time, and we're looking at the progression and giving them what they need right now. That's hugely important. I would also say it's important as we're looking at data and we're looking over time that we're looking for retention. And where I've seen this can be most difficult is in specifically math. Sometimes you teach a concept and you might see students struggle and then they get it. And then, we move on to something else. And I think this speaks to why spiraling is also important. And then later you see that thing that they seemed to have been doing well with, that concept wasn't retained. I think it tells us that maybe there wasn't quite that depth of understanding that we thought was there. It also tells us that we need to have frequent exposure to the concept, but it also tells us that that student needs a little bit more. You can see this sometimes. You'll also see it, I have seen it in retention of spelling and spelling patterns. If oftentimes a student will do well if there's someone who typically, let's say they can maybe there's not something impeding their performance, or they're not someone who has certain learning challenges, and they can do well with a pattern for the time that you're working on it. And then when you move on, again, there's that struggle. So we have to really pay attention to those things, because it's very insightful. And I think it's insightful as to why we need to be spiraling and why there needs to be heavy in-depth work, not just one time on something, but multiple times. It's just so hugely important. And I think that that would be pretty much the main points that I have to say on keeping track of student data and all of how we can kind of work through it and the big ideas behind why it's important. I kind of feel like today was kind of a little bit all over the page, but there's so many parts involved in student data and tracking, even though it seems like one of those very cut and dry things. It really isn't. I think we just really need to get good at looking and tracking and understanding how to use it in our classroom on a daily basis. So that's it, you guys. I am going to end it there because I'm noticing it's been 41 minutes. So I think we're going to go ahead and move on now to the wins and fails segment. Wins and fails. Win for the week. I would have to say my biggest win for the week is that I have been providing some kind of intense intervention on making the number 10, which is why you heard me use this as an example. It's kind of close to the front of my mind. I had some students who were really struggling with this concept. So even though we're kind of focusing, like I said, right now we're comparing numbers and comparing quantities, but I had some students who were really struggling. Just a couple of students. I had maybe 5 students who were struggling with making 10, and then I provided a whole week of kind of like small group intervention for that, and was able after the first week to exit 2 students from that group. So after another intense week of intervention on that during math workshop time, they exited. That was great. And then I still had 3 friends who were still struggling, so I did another week. So this is, week 2 of intervening during math workshop for these friends. And 2 of them, one of them for sure is like really becoming automatic at it. So I'm going to exit him out of it. I have one who seems like she's really getting it, although I'm not sure what is going on here. I have some thoughts, but it definitely seems like this student is understanding what we're doing, understanding the idea of making numbers, and specifically in this case the number 10. They're still almost like I have to be very clear on what we're doing, maybe redirecting attention, but I really think that this friend is getting it, so I'm very happy. I feel like this is a win. I did have one student who still, and I think I think I know some things of what's happening there and the why. So I guess my win is that I think I'm going to continue to work with 2 of the 3 students, but I'm really quite positive that one of them is getting it. It's just that this student's needs are a little bit different than the rest of them, so I just want to be sure. So I'm actually going to provide some more exposure and time for that student to work with the concept. And then the other one, I just also, like there's some questions there. But the win is that I really feel like most of those students have now been exited and I think are really getting it. And I just want I want to honor these other couple of students who I think need more time and some different ways to work with it. But it makes me feel good because I've kind of watched their transformation and have been able to work with them really, really closely, and kind of watch their progress and kind of see where some of the confusion is stemming from. And it makes me feel good that I'm, even though I'm still have a couple of the kiddos, like I said, I feel like one just needs a little more time. I would actually feel like this friend could be exited, but because of the guidance and support, I want to give the student time and kind of see what the student work with this concept this week, but a little bit less from me. I want to just kind of see what they can do independently. So I still want them working on the concept, because that's where my question is are we, now that the student is performing well with me there, I want to see, are we at a point of mastery? Mastery, I would say, is when the student can work at it independently. So that's kind of where my question is right now, what I want to see. So I think that student is very close to mastering it, I think. And then the other one is, I just need a little more time. So I feel good, because I feel like we're making progress. We are making progress. Fail for the week, you guys. I would just have to say, I've been fighting sickness the whole month of October, not September. Whole month of October, pretty much, I've been sick. I'm not terribly sick. I've been at work. There was 10 days that I was on antibiotics. I went off of antibiotics, and I'm not even kidding, like 2 or 3 days after that, I was sick again. I almost thought, I was like, no, please, I'm not going back on antibiotics. I thought my throat was perhaps going in that way, so I quickly got on my oregano oil. If you have strong opinions about oregano oil, that is fine. I am a desperate girl, resorting to desperate measures, which I do when it comes to my throat, because I've had so many throat issues and have had to take antibiotics so many times because of it. But I was able to not have to go on another round of antibiotics. So I'm not here to promote oregano oil or any essential oils. I do use them, but I'm not here to change anybody's mind. That's not what this is about. I'm just here to say I used it, and I did not have to use antibiotics. That's all I care about. So I would say that is a win. But the fail is that, just having been sick for so long, what happens for me, probably for most of us, when we're sick, I obviously do not feel like I'm performing at my peak. Like I'm really winning at this teaching thing. No, whenever I'm sick, I feel like, oh my goodness, I'm kind of go into survival mode. I still always try to do my best, but it is so hard. It is so hard to do your best and just be on all the time and performing at an awesome level when you are feeling subpar. So it's been a difficult month, and I would say that is my fail, but I'm starting to feel better, and I'm so thankful for that. Okay, you guys, this episode got much longer than I thought it would. I really thought that this would be a quick episode, so I'm going to end it on that. If you have thoughts, if you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. The best way to reach out to me is on Twitter. My handle is at TammyJ123. That's at TAMIJ123. Until next time.
Wait a minute. Wait 1 minute. Before you go, don't forget you can catch our show notes online at www.timetoteach.libsyn. That's libsyn.com. We're also on Facebook at Time to Teach. Don't forget to check out our Facebook group, Teachers for Effective Curriculum. And if you're an educator with your own podcast show, I invite you to join our brand new Facebook group, Teachers Who Podcast. Let's grow a community where we can network, problem solve, and discuss anything and everything podcast related. I'll see you there.